So before I open to a wider discussion and contribution, as is our norm, we will have initial response. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Shaykh Muhammad Umar Ramadan to give that response. He's been a regular member of CIMS for a number of years now and has joined the team of CIMS, recently being appointed as a fellow. We're very grateful for his contributions over the years. He's been instrumental in inviting a number of colleagues to participate today, including Shaykh Yasir. So before we move on, Shaykh Omar, please, you have 5 or 7 minutes before I open up to our wider audience.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, I would like to thank both of the respected scholars, Dr. Yasir Al-Qadi and Sheikh Ja'far Al-Adik, for their fantastic presentations in regards to Yazid and its relationship to Imam Hussain. One of the things Sheikh Yasir said in his presentation was that he gave what I would call a holistic 360 perspective of historical narrative, theological narrative amongst Sunni scholars, chronologically to what Sunni scholars have said, what Sunni scholars have adhered to. I just want to address 2-3 things. One of the earliest scholars to ever speak on this issue is al-Hussain al-Ash'ari in his Maqalat al-Islamiyin. He actually then basically puts forth the different views within Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah regarding what is Yazid. And this is one of the core differences between Ahl Sunnah, these two schools, Ahl Sunnah and Ahl Tashayyu. The Shia have a philosophy and a theology which is that the leader must, political leadership is also dependent upon Bataniya, is dependent upon the highest and the most superior individual to be leader. This is a position Ahl Sunnah doesn't recognize. Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah generally believes that the Khalifa can technically even be a Fasiq, which was later rebutted by many scholars like Abu Bakr al-Jassas and other Imams. So Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah doesn't have this view that the leader who becomes the leader of the Muslim world or the Muslim, wherever it may be, the condition upon him has to be that he has to be superior. And that was mentioned by Qadi Abu Bakr ibn Afwan. That was mentioned by Imam al-Baqilani in his Manaqib al-Imatul Arba'ah. Now, just 2 things very quickly, and I would conclude with that. One issue is this a connotation that we try to link the Shajara Mal'un to, for example, to Yazid. And this was mentioned by many scholars. And I would, in our understanding, would say that that specifically doesn't refer to Bani Umayyah as a whole. For example, we have the hadith in Abu Dawud, which is an authentic hadith that has Shaykh Yasir indicated that when Muawiya bin Abi Sufyan nominated and advocated for his son to become the Khalifa, he went to Medina, he went to specifically Marwan bin Hakam. Marwan gave the information publicly, and Abdurrahman bin Abi Bakr refused. Anyway, there was a toss between both of them, and Marwan cursed Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, and that is when Sayyidah Aisha salamullah alayha spoke from a hujra and said that no verses in the Quran were revealed regarding my family apart from the 19 verses, but I was physically there when the Prophet cursed you, Marwan, and cursed your father. So the Shajra Mal'un is specifically regarding Marwan. We can't say that's all of Bani Umayyah. We cannot say that refers to Sayyidina Uthman or a premises of attacking Sayyidina Uthman. That is extremely important. It's specifically about Marwan bin Hakam. Second point, which was mentioned, which I appreciate, was Al-Dhahabi mentions this, that from all of the goodness, that the badness he did, he had one hasanat, and I'll conclude with this, and that was that Yazid, for example, was in charge of an army, the أول جيش من أمتي يغزون مدينة قيصر مغفور لهم, which is a hadith in Bukhari 175. And this is used as a premises to show that, look, Yazid was a bad man, but he has one advantage to him. That specific view was academically rebutted historically by 2 individuals who are the students of Al-Dhahabi, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani and Imam Badruddin Aini in his Umdatul Qari. Both Imams confirm that the first army that went, the first naval expedition that went to Constantinople was in 44 after Hijri, and that was under the leadership of Abdurrahman bin Khalid bin Walid, and that wasn't under Yazid's leadership. So Yazid cannot, this hadith cannot be applied to Yazid. In fact, the army that Yazid did lead was in 4950 after Hijri, which was when Abu Ayyub al-Ansari radiallahu anhu passed away. So that cannot be used, and that is why Ibn Hajar says that Wallahu alam, we don't know why Al-Dhahabi said this, but this has no premises and has no evidence to substantiate it. But again, I want to thank both the scholars for the presentation. Specifically, Sheikh Yasser, I really enjoyed your 360 overview of all the scholars. But again, I would just add that final comment I'll say, and I'll give it back to Dr. Bujani. Yes, Ibn Taymiyyah has this view, and Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi has this view. But again, it comes down to what is our preconceived conceptions or views or opinions prior to something. And we know, for example, Ibn Taymiyyah, right or wrong, whether we like him or we are against him, he did have some, I don't want to call it Nawasibism, but he did have some animosity towards Imam Ali and towards certain members of the Ahlul Bayt. So that should also be taken in consideration. And that is also about Ibn al-Arabi, Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, the Maliki scholar, who actually in his Awasim al-Qawasim actually mentioned, and he went even further. He said that Yazid should have killed Hussein with the sword of his grandfather, Sayfi Jaddihi. And that is another debate. But again, Jazakallah khairan for all the scholars. Again, this is in one perspective. This is a platform to give different views. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward all of us. And I want to thank finally Dr. Hatim Bazian from California for also joining us today. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Shukran jazilan, Sheikh Muhammad Umar. So it's now an opportunity where I'll open up the floor, and then we will all for comments and questions, and then we will again allow opportunities for our two keynote speakers to add or to respond where necessary, or where they feel they would like to. So please, as usual, you may raise your hand using the chat function. You may draw your attention to me through making a comment in the chat box. I also at some stages may invite people to contribute to try and create a balance of contributors within our discussion. Sheikh Arif's hand has been up for some time, so I will take the liberty of giving my teacher the opportunity to speak.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can. Wonderful presentations by our esteemed speakers. Thank you so much. One of the a phenomenal presentation by our respondent Sheikh Umar, and he's answered one of the questions that I had. The expedition of Andalusia, that it wasn't Yazid that was blessed by the Prophet, but it was the first expedition, and Yazid went on the subsequent expeditions. But on a theological point, I would like to ask Sheikh Yasser a particular question, and then another one from Sheikh Jafar. The issue of takfir and cursing Yazid. If we can legitimize the takfir of Yazid, then cursing of Yazid becomes legitimate as well. Now, if we can draw our attention back to the Quran states that the Malaika did sajda, illa Iblis, except for Iblis, aba wastakbara wa kana min al-kafirin. He behaved haughtily and he refused, and he was amongst the deniers, the kuffar. Now, the Iblis believes in the unity of God. He believes in the day of judgment, as we see from the conversations between God and Iblis. And he also believes in the chosen servants of God that will go and guide mankind, and those that he will not be able to misguide. He acknowledges that. In spite of this, God says Iblis was amongst the kafir, who adamantly and bitterly denies the authority of God. And on the basis of that, the Quran sees it legitimate to curse Iblis, and God himself curses Iblis. Now, not going into the meaning of curse, whether it's hatred, which maybe it's not, but at least it's acknowledgement that this person was wrong and we need to distance ourselves from their actions. So I want to know, from the Sunni theological perspective, would this argument of Iblis hold any insight into how to understand Yazid, considering that he killed the grandson of the Prophet, who the Prophet, by admission of the Muslims, said that is an Imam, whether he stands or sits, and he is amongst the kings of the youths of paradise. And in addition to that, the desecration of Medina and the grave of the Prophet to some extent in some accounts that we find, and of course of Mecca. Then the second question to Sheikh Yasir is that, well, was Yazid's appointment in the first instance, according to Sunni historians and theologians, legitimate, considering the background of the peace treaty and the terms of the treaties made with Imam al-Hassan, where Imam Hassan makes a condition that Muawiya will not appoint his successor? So these are two questions for Sheikh Dr. Yasir, and one for Sheikh Jafar. The necessity of establishing a just government by an Imam. Is this at all something that we get from reading the early theology, or is it something that has come about recently through the Iranian Revolution and maybe legitimizing the rule of the ulama, that they had to create an Islamic state through the whole notion of Amr al-Ma'ruf? But retroactively, can we say that actually that was the case in the time of the Imams? Because very obviously we see the later Imams relinquishing their want of establishing a government. I mean, Imam Sadiq had an opportunity. The eighth Imam also had an opportunity. Is this something that we have added on at present, as opposed to it having any historical basis within early Islam? These are my questions to the two esteemed speakers.
Thank you, Sheikh Arif. So we'll go, if that's okay, Dr. Yasir, you're ready to?
So, Bismillah. Firstly, just to clarify, my entire presentation was not my views. So I want to be very clear here. I'm not going to correct al-Dhahabi or not. I'm interested in what he's saying. So this is just a summary of their interpretation. I didn't go to level 2, which I thought this was not the place to do that. So it's not the time to defend who's right, Ibn Hajar or Dhahabi. I'm just interested in what their views are about the past. So just that we're clear, everything that I said, I ascribe to a speaker. And for this lecture, I am just a narrator. I did not present my particular views. So just FYI. Also, by the way, just this minor point, Sheikh Ramadan, and I know my background would make many of you assume that this is a defense of Ibn Taymiyyah, but I'm trying not to do that. Calling Ibn Taymiyyah almost a Nasibi, it really depends on how you define the term, really, okay? And I fully understand if you define the term Nasibi in a certain way, definitely Ibn Taymiyyah would come under that definition. But the way that our theologians have defined Nasibi is a bit more precise, and that is somebody who kana yubghidu Ali radiyallahu anhu, right? And does not consider his imamah to be valid. If that is the definition of Nasibi, it would be very difficult to categorize Ibn Taymiyyah in that categorization. So just a little bit of a pushback. I fully understand, and I've read Minhaj Sunnah. In fact, it's literally, I was reading through it before our lecture, and I know exactly what he says, and I can see why it's problematic for many people. But the term Nasibi depends on how you define it. Now, as to our question by Sheikh Arif, the issue of the Iman of Iblis, actually this raises a huge, deeper theological issue, and that is ta'riful Iman wa haqiqatul Iman. How does one define Iman? And what makes a person a mu'min? And once again, we have a spectrum here within even Sunnism and Shi'ism and Kharijism and Mu'tazilism. This is actually one of the earliest debates of the Ummah, as we're all aware. What is the reality of Iman? And the issue of Iblis has been used by all of these groups as a part of their argument for their particular definitions. So the definition of one strand of Sunnism, because again, there are many strands even when it comes to this issue. The definition of one strand of Sunnism is that Iman incorporates submission of the heart and not just the knowledge. Inqiyad is the Arabic term. So if you don't have submission, Islam, istislam, inqiyad, there is no Iman, even if you have ma'rifah. So there was Jahm ibn Safwan of the past who said that Iman is only ma'rifah. If you know, then you are a mu'min. And therefore, based on his definition, Jahm would say that Iblis is a mu'min. And that's one of the things that has been ascribed to Jahm by his opponents. Allah knows if he actually said it or not. Because he said Iblis knows Allah exists and Iblis knows he sends the prophets. And this, everybody, the Mu'tazila, the Athari, the Sunnis, the Shia, they all refuted Jahm. And they said Iman is more than ma'rifah, right? There must be more than ma'rifah. And so Iblis had knowledge, but he didn't have submission. And that's why Allah says, Aba wastakbara. That's the whole point here, Aba. Whereas the sinner, the submission is in his mind, but his body doesn't submit. So when any of us commits a sin, our hearts know we should submit and we want to submit, but we become weak and we do whatever we do. So in that desire to submit is our salvation and iman. As for Iblis, Aba wastakbar, there was no even inkling of desire. So this is one Sunni. I don't know how the Shia scholars would interpret that, but the Sunni interpretation, or I should say, to be precise, one strand of Sunnism, because there are other strands even as how they define iman, but by and large it would be this issue, and that is that Iblis did not have the internal submission. He had no desire to submit to Allah. There was no yearning to submit to Allah, and therefore there is no iman in Iblis. And by the way, the issue of la'na of Iblis has been explicitly mentioned by Al-Ghazali, I believe. Yes, Ghazali mentioned this, believe it or not. So Al-Ghazali says that if even though Iblis has been cursed by Allah, he says, if somebody lived his entire life not cursing Iblis, he's not going to go to Jahannam. It's not wajib to curse Iblis. So he goes, somebody who's gray, who's don't know his reality, like Yazid, how can it be wajib to curse? Right? So he actually uses this argument against the cursing of Iblis and says you can live your whole life not cursing Iblis and you're still going to go to Jannah, because it's not wajib to curse even whom Allah cursed. That's what his, again, I'm just narrating, so don't, this is not, I'm not telling you my view here. As for the conditions of Muawiyah radiallahu anh, the issue of Muawiyah, so to be honest, again, this goes back to which narratives you follow, because we're all aware, we're all students of knowledge and trained academics and scholars here. We're all aware that there are variant narratives of history, and that our people, Sunnis and Shias, are taught mutually contradictory facts about the same incident. Both can't be possibly true, right? And so there is a basis of which narrative do you accept as having occurred, okay? And the classic example is, what happened in the Caliphate of Abu Bakr and Umar radiallahu anhum. What we are taught as Sunnis is totally different than what our Shia brethren are taught. There's completely different narratives about specific incidents that occurred, By the way, I was just doing research about the issue of the Umar radiallahu anhu allegedly attacking the house of Fatima. Sunnis don't even know this, much less believe it. It's not even something that when they hear it, they are shocked. How could anybody believe this, right? And again, I'm not getting into who's right or not. I'm simply saying there are different narratives that we are taught, right? And we need to be frank enough and brave enough and open enough to just say, look, you either believe this occurred or you don't believe it occurred. So when it comes to the conditions of Muawiyah, the Sunni sources actually, by and large, do not mention this nuqta or this point of agreeing to hand over the Khilafah to Hassan and Hussain radiallahu anhu. That's not a part of our framework, and that's not what is now. Of course, as we're all aware, you will find one or two books that mention things in Sunni and Shia sources. That doesn't mean every Sunni believes it, every Shia believes it. We all know this, right? So the normative understanding of Sunnism, and you can look up at Ibn al-Athir, Ibn Kathir, al-Dhahabi. I mean, look up any of the mainstream Sunni historians. They are not propagating this version that the promise was made to hand the Khilafah back to the Ahl al-Bayt. Okay, that's to answer your question. And again, I'm just telling you how they viewed it. I'm not getting involved right now in my own views. Allah knows best. Okay, Bismillah. Back to our Shaykh.
Shukran jazilan. Sheikh Jafar, the question regarding the reading of Imam Hussain towards government.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much to Shaykh for this question. The political theology that is, or Shi'i political theology is an ever-evolving science, as many of you will know. So, for example, there was the period prior to the 19th century when it was considered amongst the Shia fuqaha that there had to be an absolute separation between governance and political policy and the fuqaha. And that shifted in the early 1900s when it came to the Iraqi national constitution, the tobacco fatwa of Ayatollah Shirazi, and then of course the movements in Iran and Iraq, particularly with Imam Khomeini, Ayatollah al-Shaheed Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr, and so on and so forth. So this notion of the need or the duty of every imam to have to establish a government, and to only slightly reduce that or withdraw from that when it comes to certain circumstances is something that even is being debated now and will continue to be evolved in the future. So Sheikh's specific question was, is there evidence of this position from the Quran and from the Ahadith? So those people who are proponents of this view, they mention numerous ayat and Ahadith. I'll just give you a flavor of one ayah, one hadith that they will resort to. So for example, in the verse of Surah Al-Fath, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, لَقَدْ رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ إِذْ يُبَايِعُونَكَ تَحْتَ الشَّجَرَةِ. So there is a innate relationship here between the mu'mineen and the bay'ah that is given to those people in authority, of course, particularly the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. And then you have other narrations which proponents of this view will fall back on. So one, for example, is a narration from Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam himself. And this is from Tuhfa al-Uqul. Now, of course, the chain of narration is weak, but they consider that the matan of it is supremely strong and very explicit. So they will refer this to this sort of narration as an evidence of al-wilayat al-mutlaqa or al-wilayat al-amma. And I'll just give you one line from the tradition that will be sufficient as an example of those who propose or those who are proponents of this position. Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam is narrated to have said, the disaster has befallen you, or the disaster that has befallen you is greater than what has befallen others. For the true rank and degree of the ulama have been taken away from you. And of course, the definition of ulama here are the ai of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. Listen to this line now. It is the central, what they rely on centrally. The administration of the country and the issuing of orders should actually be entrusted to the religious scholars, to the ulama, who are guardians of the rights of God and knowledgeable about God's ordinances concerning what is permitted and what is forbidden. But your position has been usurped from you for no other reason than you have abandoned the pivot of truth and have disagreed about the nature of the sunnah despite the existence of clear proofs. So these and many other sorts of ayat and ahadith, proponents of this school of thought rely upon these.
Shukran jazeelan, Sheikh Jafar and Sheikh Yasser. I can see there the hand raised of Sheikh Ahmed Kauri. Please.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum
salam. Thank you very much, my esteemed scholars, Sheikh Yasser and Sheikh Jafar, inshallah. It was very beneficial, very nice to see, as others have said, the panoramic view that was presented by Sheikh Yasser from the Sunni scholars' perspective, and as well what Sheikh Jafar has presented. My question kind of lies mainly about kind of the instrumentality of both Yazid and Imam Hussain alayhim as-salam for what I kind of perceive from a Shia perspective is the notion of tawalla and tabarra seems to be a great motivator in kind of emphasizing from a Shia perspective, emphasizing kind of the negative factors of, for example, Yazid in his position against Imam Hussain in Karbala. But I find also, due to the lack of this, and correct me if I'm wrong from a Sunni perspective, you know, the notion of tabarra or disassociation, the enemies of God. But I don't know. I think it seems to be that there's a debate whether if Yazid is considered the enemy of God or not. That there seems to be kind of a diplomatic approach to the way that you know, Yazid is kind of appreciated. And for instance, Sheikh Yasser mentioned that, you know, scholars try and mention that his positive points, while accepting that he was negative points. But it seems to be kind of almost how can I say, more of a diplomatic approach from a Sunni perspective. So I guess my question would be, number one, to Sheikh Jafar, could you see, that based on the instrumentality, an instrumentality at play regarding emphasizing, Yazid's actions in regards to disassociation from a Shia perspective. But due to the lack of this from a Sunni perspective, we find that there's a degree of, diplomacy taking place where, the positive and negatives of people such as Yazid is being demonstrated by Sunni scholars.
Sheikh Yasser, I believe it's directed to yourself, actually. Or maybe we can hear from both of you on this.
It's from both, to be honest. It's from
Sheikh
both.
Yasser, I think you can go ahead, please, inshallah. Start.
So, what you are referring to as tabarru, I would say that is what I'm talking about with la'na. That's the whole point, is that there is a very mainstream strand of Sunnism, very mainstream. Dare I say, my analysis would be the majority of pre-modern scholars, where that is the default. And I am arguing that it is a modern reclamation of an Ibn Taymiyyah Ibn Arabi worldview, which was a minority pre-modernity, in which we're trying to say, okay, he might have been a bad guy, but there's no need to curse him. And as I said, nobody, as far as I'm aware, is defending Yazid against the massacres of Harra and Karbala. Nobody is doing this. That version of Nasibism is gone from the face of the earth now. So you're calling it tabarru, but the Sunni terminology is the whole issue of la'na. And I think it's the same thing. I could be wrong, but that's my understanding.
La'na is only one type of tabarra within we're talking disassociation from a general concept.
So if you mean by tabarru the takfir, then I would have to say that has not been the mainstream position ever, even in pre-modernity. Has not been.
I'm not saying takfir either. It's in regard. It doesn't need to say that he's non-Muslim. Disassociation from the character of Yazid from a Sunni perspective as a whole, rather than kind of appreciating his positive points. Yeah.
Okay, I would say, without using the word tabarru, I would say that has been the attitude of the majority of historians and theologians. We don't view him as a role model. He's not somebody we look up to. Like Imam Ahmed said, can anybody of Iman love Yazid? Like, that is mainstream Sunnism. Okay. And this moderate defense, which is Ibn al-Arabi and Ibn Taymiyyah, and I call it moderate defense, I would say it is a minority strand up until our times, and our times has resurrected that strand. Okay. Again, Allahu Alam.
Shukran jazilan. Sheikh Jafar, did you have something they wanted to add on this issue?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I only wanted to just reflect on one ayah of the Quran in Surah Hud. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in verse 113, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَلَا تَرْكَنُوا إِلَى الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا فَتَمَسَّكُمُ النَّارِ وَمَا لَكُم مِّن دُونِ اللَّهِ مِنْ أَوْلِيَاءَ ثُمَّ لَا تُنصَرُونَ. Do not incline to those who are unjust, lest the fire touches you. So here, actually, when the Shi'i scholars think about tabarra, it is that even if you incline one iota towards people of dhulm, you may sympathize with them. You might find some way to try to defend them, or you might actually cause that kind of sliding effect, that sliding down effect, where there is some sort of normalization of it. So tabarra is very much about disassociation entirely, to ensure that there's no part of the stain of that individual's actions or thought that enters into the practice of the religion itself. I will just leave it at that, inshallah.
Thank you. I can see Sheikh Muhammad Omar wants to come back. Maybe I could just ask a quick question before that. And maybe this is trying to ask Sheikh Yasser to elaborate on the aspects of his presentation which were his views. So you mentioned that you're feeling that currently the mainstream pro Banu Umayyah view, or the pro-Bani Umayyah view, has become a mainstream view, and this may be due to anti-Shia sentiment and broader questions of political theology. So I guess there's two questions there that I would like to ask. One is this really the mainstream? Because this is something which popular Shia consciousness has in their minds. And often, unfortunately, the Shia consciousness flattens the Ahl Sunnah to this voice. And I think that causes a lot of problems. So your analysis today has been very, very welcome, actually. Yeah, and of great benefit, right? So one problem Shias have, and popular Shia consciousness, is a flattening of the Ahl Sunnah position into what you have described as becoming the mainstream modern voice. So my question would be, is this really the mainstream voice currently? or is it the loudest voice? And
That's a
could you
very good
elaborate on that? And it's a genuine question from me.
Okay, that's a very, very good question. So let me rephrase. It is definitely a very loud voice. And I speak as somebody who's really awkward for me to speak because of my history and my evolution and whatnot. Whatever I say is tainted because of my association with the country and whatnot. And deep down inside, I know many of my teachers were good individuals, pious, they're sincere. It doesn't make it right what they're saying. So I'm not casting aspersion on their character. But there is a trend, there is a strand that has risen. And there's no doubt that the political domination of that country has allowed that strand to become global, right? Now, I'm being very careful because I don't want to be perceived as making every person involved in that strand to be evil, because I was a part of it and I know that's not the case. And it's so easy to demonize individuals, and I'm very against this. But we have to be clear here and say that because of the power that their platform has been given, the internet and satellites and universities and whatnot, certain voices have been given larger platforms than previously, right? And this is an example of this, where if you just log on right now, and I did this for this lecture, you know, Mawqif Ulama al-Sunnah min Yazid, and I did a Google search, right? The top searches are scholars associated with that strand. And I've mentioned by name even Sheikh Uthman al-Khamis from Kuwait, okay? Sheikh Saleh al-Fawzan, Sheikh Abdul Aziz al-Sheikh. You look at their videos and we find this, I would even say, more to the right than Ibn Taymiyyah very clearly. Ibn Taymiyyah never called Yazid Imam al-Mu'mineen, you know? I mean, he never called him. That's like going a little bit too much, you know what I'm saying? Ibn Taymiyyah said Malik min Muluk. I mean, that's so much more precise. A king amongst the kings. I actually have no problem with that as an academic statement. He was a king amongst the kings. Yani he did things he did not, he was ma kana yu'raf bis salah. This is Ibn Taymiyyah. He was not known for piety or for ilm. I mean, you find measured, you know, understanding, even if you disagree with Ibn Taymiyyah. Now you look at some of these guys and you literally say, how do you know he was a fasiq? Yani this is something that's iftira'at al-Rafida. So it's like a revolution. It's like what do you call the term is what's the term? Critical re-evaluation. What's it called? Revisionism. That's what the term is, revisionism, right? You have a revisionism taking place about Yazid that Ibn Arabi, Ibn Taymiyyah never did. And that revisionism involves absolving him of any responsibility. Even Ibn Taymiyyah said that Yazid did not command the killing of Hussein, but it was obligatory on him to punish those who did. This is Ibn Taymiyyah speaking. Ibn Taymiyyah says, وَكَانَ وَاجِبًا عَلَيْهِ, and he didn't do that. So he's at fault. And Ibn Taymiyyah says that Harra is his 100% fault. This is Ibn Taymiyyah. Now you go to these modern guys, and some of them are like, well, and this is, by the way, this book here, well, I mean, honestly, as a Muslim, I was shocked. Like, I couldn't believe some of the stuff I'm reading from this book, where the author is softly defending Harra, which is just mind-boggling, and completely absolving. This is me speaking now. You can hear me getting emotional, right? Completely absolving Yazid from Karbala 100%. Like Ibn Taymiyyah says, you know, he should have done something. And this author basically goes, it's not his fault. He clearly was not, you know, angry at Ibn Ziyad and cursed him. That's enough. He didn't need to be done. So we have now clearly, I would say, without a doubt, a trend that is not mainstream whatsoever. It's not even Ibn Taymiyyah. It's more to the right of Ibn Taymiyyah. Now, why is this happening? This is my analysis as somebody who's lived the movement. And I can't verify this. It is my analysis. It's Allah knows best. The first I said is the geopolitics of the clash between modern Shi'ism and modern Sunnism, and the global dynamics taking place, where this strand has taken on the cause of Yazid as being reactionary to the other strand, right? So it has become an issue because of this. And secondly, and I think this is very clear in light of this strand's, complete acquiescence to the ruler. Like the notion of this strand of Salafism, which is mainstream Salafism, is you must obey the ruler, ta'at wali al-amr. And this is, of course, having repercussions on all issues of the Arab Spring, you know, the Muslim Brotherhood, I mean, everything. And so it's not just Shi'ism and anti-Shi'ism, it's anti-Muslim Brotherhood as well, right? And anti-Arab Spring as well. And because of this, unbelievably, you find sentiments that Hussein, may Allah have mercy on him, but he made a mistake by khuruj ala al-imam, khuruj ala al-khalifa. And you don't find this sentiment that explicitly even in Ibn Arabi and Ibn Taymiyyah. You don't find it that I would say maybe hints or whatnot, but you don't find it like the way that it is phrased now, that Hussein radiallahu anh, it was wajib upon him to obey Yazid, not allowed to khuruj ala al-khalifa and whatnot. So this is a modern, and it's definitely not the bulk of Sunni Islam. It's really this one strand. But as you correctly pointed out, they have a platform that allows them to be very, very loud. And you want my own opinion? I'm very disappointed in this strand. And I speak as a Sunni here, that I have no problems with Ibn al-Jawzi and Imam Ahmed and their verdicts on this individual. And we don't view him, and this is mainstream Sunnism, we don't view him in a positive light. And he is responsible. And I know I gave a controversial lecture on Karbala. I know a lot of our Sunni brethren, Shia brethren disagreed with it. But I did say in that lecture, which was revolutionary for me 8 years ago to say, and it caused a backlash, that the buck stops with Yazid. And Yazid is responsible. I said it in that lecture, and I stand by it. I know it wasn't enough for many people, but even that phrase, it caused a backlash in my own community, because that's not something that they were accustomed to hearing. And it is something I firmly believe. Whether he commanded or not, that's an interesting question. Definitely he benefited, and definitely he did not reprimand anybody. And let me get emotional here, and I fully understand. There was blood on the hands of people, the blood of the grandson of the Prophet ﷺ, and the one who was the head of the ummah did nothing to wipe that blood. How can you not blame responsibility on that person? Really, how can you not? So Allahu A'lam, his affair is with Allah. As for the cursing and whatnot, as Imam Ahmed said, it's not my madhab or methodology to curse other people, but I leave his affair to Allah. And there's no respect that the bulk of us have to this individual. And it is definitely a lot of crimes that this person has committed. But, and I have to say this, and I'm sorry to be so blunt, but that's the whole purpose here. We, Ahl Sunnah, view this entire era as a historical tragedy, not as a theological tragedy. That is one of the main differences between Sunnism and Shiism, as you're all aware. It hurts us from a point of view of history, but it doesn't affect our theology, because we don't view this entire era as affecting our beliefs and our creed. As you're aware, this is one of the main differences between Sunnis and Shias.
Thank you so much. And we appreciate you elaborating and on your thoughts. We really do. Yeah, Shaykh Muhammad, Umar, Ramadan, please.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Bujani. Shaykh Yasir Al-Qadi, I want to first of all thank you for your bravery. I know being very open from what you previously said and what you previously associated with. I think it's very brave for someone of your stature to be quite open and be frank and blunt in what you said. And I would also echo exactly what you said, that I don't believe it's the majority view. Again, speaking as a Sunni scholar or Sunni individual, I don't believe that's the majority view in the common world. But what we've seen in the Arab world specifically, this isn't a major issue, nor do they speak about it. It is more of an Indian subcontinent. It's a massive it's become a theological issue. It's become an issue between Haqq and Batil. And hence the reason why it's so widely mentioned in Pakistan and India. And what's actually happened, exactly, I agree. We've actually revised that view, that extreme view. So we've taken Ibn Taymiyyah position, or Ibn al-Arabi's position. We've gone even extreme to legitimize dictatorship, to legitimize oppression, and to legitimize certain political views. And we've done it at the expense of the Ahlul Bayt. And I finish off with what Shah Waliyullah Muhaddis Dehlwi, the great Indian subcontinent scholar, said. And he was speaking about Ibn Hajar al-Haythami. Ibn Hajar al-Haythami wrote a book called Sawaik al-Muhrika, which was a direct rebuttal of Shia. It's a very harsh book in wording. And Shah Waliyullah says something quite unique in it. He says that he was muta'assab, he was very extreme in what he said. And he says, beware of this extremism, rebuttal the Shias, but never do it at the expense of the Ahlul Bayt. So again, I just want to thank Shaykh Yasir for being very open and very balanced. So Jazakallah khair. Jazakallah khair, Dr. Bujani. Thank you.
We have some time for final comments and questions. Scholars are welcome to make their contributions. I invite them to do so. Before we move to Sheikh Muhammad, Dr. Khalid, it's rare that we don't have many. Normally, I'm struggling to handle the requests for comments and contributions, and so I rarely get opportunity to share my own thoughts and ask my own questions. So, as people are considering if they have anything further to add, maybe I can ask another couple of, and make one point and ask an additional question. So I guess my comment is on the back of what Sheikh Yasser has said, and maybe it builds on a question which Sheikh Arif was trying to direct us towards initially when he spoke to Sheikh Jafar. If one of the challenge or one of the impetuses behind the pro Banu Umayyah voice has been the Salafi political theology, if that's the case, is the anti-Shia sentiment that we see actually an anti-politicized reading of Shiism, which also undoubtedly has become the loudest voice. Again, whether it's the mainstream voice or not is a different question. Recently being in a convention among specialists in Shia studies, one esteemed professor made the point. It says that people can't think in Shia scholarship outside of 1979 revolution. It had such a dramatic impact on Shia thought. So now for the reception of the modern developments in Shia thought beyond Shias, they see it as a politicized movement. Is that part of the challenge, actually, between the loudest voice of Sunnism and the loudest voice of Shiism, both being explicitly politicized? One looking for political rulership, another one advocating absolute obedience to status quo. So maybe I'll ask both speakers to comment on that. Secondly, I don't feel, I think the distinction that we're making between, I would ask, how tenable is the distinction between reading the past as being historical and theological? Because when we read if we were to read the history of the incidents of Karbala as being purely historical and not having a political implication, isn't the dominant Sunni political theology about the legitimacy of a standing Khalif, even if he be a Fasiq, a post-Karbala development? So the second question is directly to Sheikh Yasser. The first is to both Sheikh Jafar and Sheikh Yasser.
Why don't Sheikh Jafar go first? Because I was speaking too much. I'd like to hear his thoughts.
I think I was interested more in the second question than the first question. Go ahead. Can you just clarify then one more time, just the first question, just to repeat it for us?
So basically, the dominant voice of modern Shiism is a politicized voice, okay, which is framed, is framed in a discourse of state. Okay, so is there a conflation now between Shiism and such a reading of Shiism, and is that part of the problem in terms of this apparent tension that we see out there in the world? And
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I'm not necessarily given to the assumption that's made in the question. When we say that there is a dominant reading, what we might be suggesting is that there's a dominant reading from the majority of the Hawza of Qum. And even within Qum and outside of Qum, I mean within Iran, such as the Hawzat of Mashhad, this opinion is not necessarily there. And then when you go, for example, to Najaf and beyond, even in Iraq, we don't necessarily see the same reading. Actually, it can often be a depoliticized understanding and still rooted in a theological understanding. We know that within the wider scope of Shi'ism, there are different lines of marja'iyya, different lines of theology that are present at the moment. And some are more firmly emphasizing just the theology of tabarra, and not taking necessarily from that as the impetus to have to create a political theology from the movement of Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam. So I'm not sure I accept the assumption that is in there.
So I said the loudest voice was and I'm making an analogy with our previous.
I just want to be able to tell my audience, especially those who may not be so acquainted with Shi'i political theory, that there is that separation that exists within them. But then I would agree that the loudest particular voice is that one that is trying to reread the movement of Karbala through a political lens and then trying to apply it. Now, how far that can actually go is really quite questionable here, because it also then requires the ordinary individual to also acquiesce to this understanding as well. And you don't actually find necessarily that the majority of the ordinary individual is understanding the movement of Karbala in the same way. And the reason for that has been that the dominant inheritance of the Shi'i culture has been, even until to now, centered around mourning activities. And so the implication, or rather the application of that, has still, I think, yet to catch up. I think we are still a couple of decades away from that at best, if that movement moves from being the loudest voice to the application of that movement. For example, here in the UK, when the 10, 12 days of the Majlis of Imam al-Hussain takes place, or the 2 months and 10 days takes place, it's very little to do with a political movement. And then if you actually think about that, about Pakistan, in India, I would challenge to see where that becomes the dominant voice. I would say the voice may be the loudest, but the application is not there.
Shukran jazeelan. Thank you.
So from my side, I really don't feel the best qualified to answer your first question, because obviously it requires an intricacy of the knowledge of intra 12-ver dialogues and disputes and trends. And I am not familiar with that, but I'll just speak holistically again, that I think it is undeniable that the geopolitical changes taking place impact intra-Sunni Shia dialogue. I think this is this has been the case since 1979. And if you look at the most famous treatises that came out in the early 80s, it was a result of the Iranian Revolution, right? So I think that us academics / activists in our communities, especially in the West, we need to be extra cognizant that the teachers we look up to are being swept away in geopolitics. And we have to ask ourselves that, do we really want to import that political tension to our communities in England and America? Because a lot of this tension is stemming from issues that are not purely theological. And I think the simplest example is this recent spat between Yemen and Saudi. For the first time, the Salafis started attacking the Zaydis, and that has never happened. And, and I'm well aware, because I'm connected with that audience there, all of this anti-Zaydism and the Zaydis say this and whatnot, and Zaydis haven't changed their theology for 800 years. And yet we see in the last decade this rise of rhetoric about Zaydism. So we have to, I think, as Western individuals living for our communities, be extra careful that we don't divide our already divided communities about these issues. I think that's the only point I have for your first question. I don't feel qualified to talk about internal, trends within Shiism. As for the issue of obeying the Khalifa, you're actually raising a far more awkward conversation, which is transcending even our dialogue. And that is, how do we view these ahadith about obeying the ruler? And do we view them as having been piously fabricated, which is a strand of Sunnism? They say this, they say this. They're Sunnis, and yet they say this entire genre, it is a result of politics of the Umayyads and Abbasids, well, Umayyads to be more precise. And they call them, and they are Sunni, but obviously, to be clear, that's not mainstream Sunnism, for one simple reason, that the genre of a hadith that talk about obeying the ruler, from our perspective as Sunnis, it is pretty much mutawatir. And you find a hadith in Bukhari and Muslim and Abu Dawud and Tirmidhi that are not related to Shi'ism, Sunnism. They're simply generic about obeying the ruler. And because of this, as you are aware, Sunnism has been, generally speaking, politically quietist, in that, as you're aware, obviously, one of the main differences, the political office is not viewed as being an extension of theology. So you can have a bad politician and your religion is still good in your own life, right? So again, that's Sunnism for you, that the political ruler is independent of your iman and aqidah and worship. And from Sunni perspective, they can find thousands of earlier scholars, including like Ibn Umar during the fitna, where he's neither fighting with Imam Hussain or Hussain radiallahu anh, or on the side of Yazid. He's like, I just don't want to get involved. And even Ibn Taymiyyah says Ibn Umar's position was the best. Like, just stay out of all of this. That's his perspective. He didn't side with Yazid, but he didn't side with Hussein radiallahu anh as well. And it is reported that people like him, Ibn Abbas as well, that they basically said is going to cause a greater problem to unsheath the sword. And as you're probably aware, Ibn Taymiyyah has a famous statement: never in our Islamic history has the sword been unsheathed for a good cause, except that the evil that has emanated from that has been worse than the evil that they were trying to eliminate in the first place. So the issue of whether these ahadith are because of the political tensions is one that is a position of, I would call this movement the neo-rationalist school within Sunnism. So you have people like Dr. Adnan Ibrahim, famous Arab preacher, in Europe somewhere, I forgot where he is, and others of this, where there's a healthy dose of skepticism about hadith overall. And they have no problem saying that this entire genre clearly is politically oriented and we should simply not deal with it. But to be statistical, and I'm not taking sides in this one, the bulk of Sunnism would not go there because, as you're aware, they view especially Bukhari and Muslim with a special status, and these hadith of obeying the ruler are found in Bukhari and Muslim. Wallahu alam.
Shukran jazeelan. Thank you. Okay, so unfortunately, my understanding was we were due to finish at 8 p.m., but I see the program was scheduled till 7:30. So we try to draw to a close now. So I'll ask Sheikh Arif to give his final questions, and then we move to conclusions from Dr. Khalid. Sheikh Arif, final comments.
Thank you. Thank you for having me again. I would just like to get some clarity on what Dr. Yasir said, that Karbala was a historical tragedy, not a theological one. Are we to believe, therefore, that Khilafah is just a political office? Because in those very early days of Khilafah, we see Khilafah as being the Khilafah of Rasul or Khilafatullah. Later on, we had this notion of Khilafatul Rashida that was acknowledged and that finished with the abdication of Hassan Salamullah alayhi to Muawiya of Khilafah. But in those early days, the Khalifa was seen as the Khalifa of Allah, and therefore the conduct of the Khalifa impacted theology and religious understanding and the notion of piety. From the Shia perspective, we do also have this understanding that Imam Hussain also made very clear that a Khalifa of the Prophet cannot be one who is fasiq and fajir, in reference to Yazid's actions of either killing innocent people or his consumption of alcohol and so on and so forth. So what I want to understand from Dr. Yasir is that if Khilafah is a political office, then what do we say about the Khulafa that went before Muawiyah? Is there Khilafah, Khilafatullah and Khilafah Rasulullah, or just a political office, in which case theologically their conduct, their actions have no implication? On the other hand, if Khilafah and Khilafatullah are concomitant, Khilafah of Allah, then it has to impact us theologically, in which case Yazid and his actions impact our theological thinking as well. And then I have one more comment to make, just a comment after that. Sorry.
Please.
So, Dr. Arif, your question is very profound, and there's no way I can do justice in a few minutes. Let me speak as a Sunni academic. What I'm about to say is not Sunni theology. It is my own opinions. It is very clear, and this is me speaking, that early Islam had a plethora of views about the divine nature or lack thereof of the caliphate and the office of the caliphate. It is very clear that you had an entire spectrum, and there is no clear-cut Sunni or Shi'i position in the first 1,500 years. That's my analysis. And even within Sunnism, people like Abdullah ibn Zubayr would have agreed with exactly what you just said. What you just said, he would have agreed with it, and that's why he rebelled. Okay, and he's Sunni. He's not considered to be Shia by anybody. He is somebody who would have viewed the office of caliphate, like why would and the rebellion of Medina as well. So Abdullah ibn Hanbala, the chieftain of the rebellion, he said the exact same thing. How can we have a fasiq, fajir, mudmin, sharabi as the Khalifa? It's not appropriate. And so the entire people of Medina would be very sympathetic to what you said, because they could not view the office of caliphate as being worthy for somebody who's a fasiq and a fajr. Now, I would say as an academic that Sunni theology, and I would dare also say with most respect, Shi'i theology evolved over the next 2-3 centuries. To me, that's patently clear. And ideas and notions were ossified and were then back projected onto the first generation. The first 100 years, you have this diversity of thought. You don't have a clear-cut, uniform understanding. You just don't. It's too early for that. And you would have people who would have thought of the office of caliphate, and again, this is my analysis, people like Abdullah ibn Abbas, that I would say Abdullah ibn Abbas is the perfect example of this notion of Yazid is an evil person, I hate his guts, but you know what? According to our books, he told Hussain radiallahu anh, don't do this, it's going to cause your own harm and you're not going to gain much. This is our narrative. I know it's not the Shia narrative, but that kind of shows a later interpretation of Sunnism that is now the dominant, which is that Yazid and his caliphate are a secular institute, i.e., even if Yazid is evil, the religion of Islam does not inherently change. It's different. That's an office of the caliphate. His job is to be the ruler. He could be a good ruler, a bad ruler. The religion remains the same. Okay. And then you had those like Ibn Zubayr, or like, Abdullah ibn Handala, who's like, we need to have a righteous person and a good person. And then you have I would call them the proto-Shia, and again, this is my academic, I know you would respectfully disagree, who said it's not just a righteous institution, it is a divinely ordained institution where the Khalifa has to be somebody whom Allah Azza wa Jal himself has, chosen via the wasi and via, the commandments of the previous Ahlul Bayt or whatnot. This entire spectrum is found in the first 100 years and is going to develop and ossify. Nowadays, now that we're 14 centuries down, it is safe to say mainstream Sunnism does not view the role of the caliph in light of theology. The caliph is somebody who could be good or bad, positive or negative. And as you're all aware, Sunnism has now accepted Imamat al-Mafdul, Khilafat al-Mafdul. There is no controversy now. Now there's no controversy. Obviously, Ibn Zubayr would not have accepted this, okay? There would have been controversy in the past. So we have to be very pedantic in the evolution of ideas and be careful to not back project a 7th century understanding onto the people of the 1st century, and be brave enough, even of our own tradition, to study how ideas evolved and ideas were debated amongst our own constituents. And then finally, a majority came out, and that majority is now called orthodoxy, whether it is Orthodox Sunnism or Orthodox Shi'ism. So Orthodox Sunnism, as you're aware, is quietistic overall. You obey the ruler unless you see kufr bawah, unless you see etc. So I hope that answers your question. Allahu alam.
No, I'm very encouraged by your answer. No, thank you so much. I do obviously want to make a little observation that it was way too early to say that there were proto-Shias or Sunnis. I don't think such a distinction really existed, but proto-Shia, yeah, maybe. But Shia as an esoteric sort of an understanding of Islam was definitely there. But as a political school of thought, no, I doubt it. Or a theology, Sunni, Shia, both of them did not exist. But yeah, maybe.
I agree with you, by the way. I just mean the trends. I don't mean actual sects. So again, interestingly enough, Hussain radiallahu anh and Yazid, in my opinion, would, and again, I understand this is controversial for the rest of the folk, would not have viewed themselves as being two different sects of Islam.
Yeah, I concur with you fully.
They would not have viewed themselves as being two different sects, but the kernel has been put, and this is now going to develop. Ibn Abbas would not have viewed himself as being separate, but the kernel has been put, and that's going to develop a tree later on, which is now going to have mainstream Sunnism, right? And you have Ibn Zubayr, the kernel has been put. The Hanafis, by the way, are Ibn Zubayr. The Hanafis did not view wujub of the Khalifa if he's fasiq. The Hanafi madhab allows for khuruj, and that's Ibn Zubayr. That's not, Ibn Abbas, so I'm saying that's what I mean by proto. The kernel has been put, not that there's a clear demarcation. Allahu Akbar.
Yeah, so just one last comment. I think
briefly, Shaykh.
Sorry, do I stop?
Briefly.
Okay. I do feel that the early Khalifa Abu Bakr And Khalifa Umar did not view themselves as the Khulafa of God as such, just the political heads. I think people had conflated in their minds that the Khalifa of the Prophet, he has some form of divine ordinance, I don't know, ordained by God. However, the one comment that I would like to make after listening to both of our esteemed presenters is that surely we should have some method of minimalistically establishing history that we can concur upon and say, okay, this is without doubt. The rest of it is suspicious. So let's go and run with that, the minimal history that we can establish, and then to see whether it has theological implication or not. And that would be quite a profound contribution going forward.
Very good idea. You have my vote.
Sheikh Jafar, do you want to make a final concluding comment? Because we haven't had the opportunity to hear much from you over the last half an hour, and then move to Dr. Khan.
I just want to respond to Sheikh Hara's point, and I think that what's been achieved in some way here tonight actually is a step towards that unified history. Actually, when you heard Sheikh Yasser's introduction, before going into the spectrum, so much of the history is agreed upon. And then as we go forward, we actually need to find more common ground in the theology and in the fiqh here. And that's when actually we move away from the sectarian understanding of Islam and actually revert back to what we stated was the actual original understanding of Islam, that there was just an Islam, one Islam. And we move away from the sectarianism that has so badly destroyed us, sadly, in our own souls.
Shukran jazeelan. So I move to Dr. Khalid to make some concluding comments, and we thank you all for your participation.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We are very extremely grateful to our esteemed and well-respected speakers. Alhamdulillah, they have sacrificed their time, valuable time, for this great event on this great and remarkable topic. Sheikh Jafar Ladik, mashallah, he has presented his Shia perspective on this given topic quite successfully and quite comprehensively. Great academic work. And we are very especially grateful to Dr. Sheikh Yasser Al-Qazi, mashallah, who is well-known figure and worldly acknowledged scholars and enjoying the immense following throughout the world. And we know him very well. And this is the first time for him to enter into this arena. MashaAllah, may Allah give you great reward. And you have presented exactly the proper and authentic mawqif of Ahlul Sunnah regarding this important topic. May Allah give you great jaza. Because on this forum, we have been concerned here presenting the proper and the true stance of Ahlul Shia and also Ahlul Sunnah, not the popular one. You know, the popular stance from both sides, it has been established by debaters, by, you know, the emotional speakers, or I must say the religious wrestlers. This is new term, religious wrestler. So the proper mawqif is confined to muhaqqiqeen and ulama ar-rasikhuna fil ilm, mashallah. And we have been discussing, and we have the same dialogue for the last 6 years. And we have discussed, and I'm sure Sheikh Muhammad Umar Ramazan has informed you about this forum and the CIMS. And we have discussed quite sensitive, controversial issues, such as the position of Ahlul Bayt, position of Sahaba, position of 3 Khulafa, and many other issues in the same way. And we have dissipated the misconceptions, misunderstanding, and to understand each other and to establish the mutual understanding, mutual respect, especially to provide the solutions to the outside world where Sunnis and Shias, they are fighting, killing each other, basing on misconceptions and misgivings only. Thank you very much for your great work. And obviously this topic, position of Yazid and the stance of Imam Hussain, this is not from those sensitive, controversial topics between Sunnis and Shias. The main purpose was to clarify the position of Sunnis, because to many Shias, they thought the Nasbiism and proper Sunnis, this is compounded mix, and we have to clarify. And alhamdulillah, Dr. Yasser Qazi, he has been successful in this regard. Time is very short. Very quickly, I am running here few points to clarify. Position of Sheikh Allama ibn Taymiyyah, this is very controversial. I have studies here, and to some extent, he seems to be against Ahlul Bayt, but this is not the case because I have studied the case. In his final moments, he regretted and he changed his views, right, in favor of Ahlul Bayt. For example, this is a great incident when one of the Mongols ruler, he embraced Islam and he visited Damascus, and he called upon all great ulama. And for your information, all Mongol, after accepting Islam, they were very inclined towards Ahlul Bayt, the family of the Holy Prophet. And did it ask the question, are there any Nawasib, the people hating Ahlul Bayt? Ibn Taymiyyah was the most important ulama when he called upon there, and he answered no to the ruler. There used to be, but no, not at the moment. So in his final days, he changed a lot of things. I think that was big enough. And regarding the responsibility of Yazid, because this is my special topic, I also, produced the work yet not published, right? Yazid is responsible because we find some clear incidents and his statements regarding killing Hazrat Imam Hussain through Ibn Ziyad as well and directly. Because in a well position, I agree with Shia Sunni, because in a well position to avenge the blood of Imam Hussain. Later incidents, the Waqia al-Harra incident of Kaaba, also supporting this stance. Apart from his clear statement, no time to go through that. And very importantly, people like Ibn Ziyad, Shimr, Al-Kholi, they were not in position to kill the men like Imam al-Hussain and the family of the Holy Prophet in Karbala in such a way without consent of the authority from Damascus. It's not possible for them. This is another topic just for clarification. The issue of Lanat, this is not, from the staple parts of theology. I agree with the opinion of Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, rahimahullah, in this connection. Cursing is not, this is from the consequential issue, subsidiaries. The major issue is the mission and the stance of Imam al-Hussain and the position of Yazid, his mission, his policies, and his character, and which is obviously has been elaborated successfully by our guest speaker. And also, let me clarify here the position of Ibn Kathir, Ibn Yasib, Ibn Khaldun, Hafiz al-Zahabi, and people like that. They are from the later sources, not from the early sources. Their statements must be viewed in the light of the early sources, as At-Tabaqat and At-Tabari, and in the same way, At-Tariq al-Islami, Khalifa bin Khayyat al-Usfuri, the Ustad of Imam Bukhari, even the work of Imam Bukhari, An-Nasai, and Musannaf ibn Abi Shayba, in the books of Hadith, Ahl Sunnah, the great work of the history, early history of Islam is also provided with proper asnad. They're also giving a lot of knowledge in this connection. And one thing I must clarify, because I'm mustanad historian as well, my PhD is in the science of history. History, to some extent, is also compounded, related to theology as well. In the history, when you go into the detail, right? So a lot of incidents of history, they are combining the theology as well. You cannot, separate the history from theology. This is the part of the science of history. Then we have to understand the mission of Hazrat Imam al-Hussain in the light of the ahadith of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which amount to the tawatur in respect of Ahlul Bayt, and they have been recorded by all muhaddithun and mufassirun as well. And the khutbahs and the sermons of Hazrat Imam al-Hussain, we have to view and we have to read very carefully. We can understand the mission of Imam Hussain. So that's all. Once again, I have to, express my deep-hearted gratitude to our guest speakers, Sheikh Yasir Qazi, Sheikh Jafar Latin, and also my brother Sheikh Muhammad Umar Ramazan, his great contribution and clarification to that. However, he is one of the great members of CIMS and one of our colleagues organizing this work, one of the great organizers, of this work. May Allah give you great jaza and reward. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I won't take any more time from our colleagues, except for that we hope that we can now, as this pandemic is, at least in the UK, the situation is changing. We hope that soon we will be able to meet in person. As we move back, hopefully, to in-person events, we hope not to sever our international ties. And we hope that the colleagues who have joined us today from India, from California, from the States, will continue to participate in our activities, contribute to these sessions. And I thank you all for your time. May Allah reward you. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad.